All right, so our presentation tonight, Less Lawn, More Life, Reimagining Yards as Wildlife Habitat, is sponsored by the Pollinator Pathway of Addison County, which we call PPAC. Raise your hand if you've heard of PPAC. All right, so I'm going to keep the introduction very short about what we are. We were founded in 2022, and we consist of a steering committee made up of facilitators from area towns around Addison County. We meet monthly, and in the past 2 or 3 years, we've presented educational webinars like this one. We've sponsored garden visits, we've held book discussions, written articles for the newspaper, and we aim to create connections and community as we learn together with friends and neighbors about the importance of native pollinators and how to create habitat for them. So these are native bees, moths, birds, bats, butterflies, and beetles, and I may have left out a few. Some of our town groups have created beautiful pollinator-friendly gardens in public spaces, and maybe you've seen some of those. There's one in Weybridge, there's one in Lincoln, there's one here in Middlebury. There's wonderful gardens, and we're always looking to create more public spaces so everyone can enjoy this. Many of us have created habitats in our own yard. So we have the clipboard in the back. If you would like to join a pollinator group in your town, you should make a note of that, and make a little asterisk and put it at the bottom, what town you're in, and if you'd like to join a group. And also, if your town doesn't have a pollinator group, Pollinator Pathway group, you can let us know and we can help you start one. So the format this evening is Emily will speak for about 50 minutes, and at that point, if you need to leave, you can do so. There'll be a little break, but then there will be a good 20 minutes for questions. And then in the back, we have a lot of handouts, and you can take your phone, you can take pictures of anything you want. Emily has some handouts, and PPAC has some handouts. So let's see, there's an exit here, and there's an exit over there. And the bathrooms are, you go through those doors and to the left. So I think that's it for housekeeping. Okay, I'm delighted to have Emily May here. Again, speaking for PPAC, she's one of our favorite presenters. She's a pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society's pesticide program. Emily graduated from Middlebury College, where she majored in biology, right? I thought I had that right. And created a wonderful pollinator garden on campus nearby Hall. So if you're ever wandering around Middlebury College, you can see her pollinator garden still there all these years later. Emily received a Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University, where she studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pesticides on wild bee communities. Her work at Xerces since 2015 has focused on supporting pollinators through habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. Emily lives in Cornwall, where she works on her own pollinator habitat. It's amazing. Every time I go by there, I see it's growing. So please welcome Emily May tonight.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you so much for everyone being here tonight. It does not look like we're about to be in spring, but we are going to be in spring soon. So I hope you're going to be excited to see some photos of flowers and photos of bugs and birds, and get excited about creating some habitat for wildlife around your homes. So this is actually from my yard, Fran, from one of the wildflower plantings that we've done in our yard. So if you're not familiar with our organization, I know many of you in this room are familiar faces at this point, and so you are familiar with Xerces Society, which is the group that I work for. But we work to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates, or spineless animals, and their habitats. Invertebrates are animals without a backbone, and they make up over 95% of known species in the natural world. They are all around us, and they are playing really critical roles in our lives and in our survival. They may be small, but they are incredibly important. They are the base of the animal food web. They are turning plants into digestible fat and protein for other animals. They're helping plants reproduce. from trees and shrubs to wildflowers and fruits and vegetables. And they're breaking down dead plants and animals and returning that back to the soil. So they're doing all of these incredible services for all of the rest of us. And, of course, free pest control. But they're also facing tough times. So Xerces, as an organization, has staff across the country. I'm one of 2 here in Vermont, but we have staff in over 25 states, about 100 at this point. And our main office is in Oregon. We mostly focus on habitat building in working lands, and then we also focus as well on endangered species protections, some applied research. We do a lot of community science work to try and learn more about bumblebees and fireflies and other insects that haven't been well discovered or explored. And then my team, which is the small one that just thinks about pesticides, which is kind of the bummer side of all of this. So I'm happy to be here talking about habitat tonight for the most part. Our work extends far beyond our staff, so we rely on partnerships with groups, local groups like PPAC, as well as Bee Cities, community science volunteers who come in and want to monitor bumblebees, state and federal agencies that we work with, and other people who just want to help protect pollinators and other wildlife in their neighborhoods. So I want to appreciate your donations at the door tonight. They're going straight to PPAC, but this talk is supported by PPAC. I know there's also Xerces members in the audience tonight. So this is the first and last time that I'll mention this, but our work is very much supported by our membership, especially in light of the financial instability at the federal level at the moment. This is increasingly important. So I just want to say thank you so much for your membership, and let's talk about insect declines and why we're here to reimagine our yards. Oh, these are signs that we have available if you become a member. So, have you ever noticed that now you don't have to clean bugs off your windshield as often as you did before? Yeah, okay. Obviously, there's some exceptions. I've had a few nights driving down Field Days Road where I've had a pretty good bug splatter on the windshield. But in general, the front of our cars is a lot cleaner than it used to be. And that's not just in our imaginations. That's actually a real phenomenon that's been studied by scientists, and it mirrors real changes in insect populations. It's not just because our cars are more aerodynamic, it's because there's less bugs. So around the world, there have been long-term studies looking at insects and seeing significant reductions in insect biomass, or the mass of insects, all over the world and in long-term studies. So this is the abundance of butterflies across the United States has gone down over the last 30 years. Butterflies are really declining in many, many different kinds of environments around the United States. There are also studies from Germany and from Puerto Rico that have found really significant reductions in the amount of insects out there. More than 70% decline across 63 sites in Germany over the last 27 years, a 10-fold reduction in biomass since the 70s in Puerto Rico. So there's increasing evidence from many quarters. But what does that actually mean? What does insect biomass do for us? So if birds had newspapers, I think the headlines would read something like, "Where are all the caterpillars? Food supplies in crisis. Production declines by 30 to 50% since the 1980s. So caterpillars are really what turns this indigestible amount of plant matter. They are doing this fundamental role of turning this lush and indigestible biomass into fat and protein that can be eaten by other animals and digested. So this is basically a little hot dog walking around on leaves, right? This is a Cecropia moth caterpillar, and this weighed 3 milligrams at birth. Within a month, it grew to 5,000 times its size. So these are really good at growing fast and turning into a very fatty snack that can be taken up by birds and other wildlife. I thought my kid grew fast. I had a big kid at birth, but if he grew as fast as one of these, he would have been the size of a fire truck at a month old. And before you think, well, that's great for birds, what does that do for us and other big animals? Insects are actually really essential wildlife food for big animals too. Who here is familiar with the miller moth? A few of you. Yep. So miller moths are also army cutworms, known as a pest of crops around the country. They start their lives all over the country. And then as adults, they migrate to the Rocky Mountains. So they're coming from all over the country and then migrating to the Rocky Mountains for the summer, where they shelter under rocks to get through the heat of summer. So does anyone here eat the peanut butter balls at the co-op? Just me and my toddler? Well, these guys are like peanut butter balls for wildlife. They hide out under these rocks, and the grizzly bears come along, and they turn over the rocks, and they eat the moths. And they can actually sustain a grizzly bear. About a third of a grizzly bear's diet can consist of these miller moths. So their bodies are about 75% fat. So it's a pretty incredible source of nutrition for grizzly bears and other wildlife. So we want to know more about what insects are declining and where, but on the whole, we know that there's enough to act on now. There's good reason to believe that there are going to be species that go extinct before we even realize they existed, right? So importantly, before we even understand what contributions they were bringing to the world. So it's time to do something. Insects, like a lot of other wildlife, face a perfect storm of stressors. The big ones being loss of their habitat, places to live, food resources, shelter, pesticide use, climate change, diseases, and invasive species. These threats are overlapping, they compound with each other, they interact with each other, and they're happening everywhere, right? Not just in wild places, but in our neighborhoods, in our yards. So this feels overwhelming, but one of the reasons I went into bugs and not into climate change policy was because this is something that we can all do something about right in our yards, and it makes a difference. There's pretty simple things any one of us can do in the next month to improve the conditions for insects and other wildlife. So what do insects need? I know this is going to be very small text for some of you in the back, so I will be saying it out loud so you can hear it too. Like the rest of us, it really comes down to three big things: food, shelter, and a safe place to live. So food meaning native plants that provide nectar and pollen, and in some cases host plants to feed young. So caterpillars develop on a specific kind of plant. For predators, it means having prey species around. Shelter means safe places to nest and overwinter. That can mean bare ground. It can mean stems if it's an insect that lives in a plant stem, or leaf litter. And then finally, refuge from pesticides, not just the ones that are used on farms, but around our homes and yards as well. Large natural areas, big, protected areas that have forests and wetlands and meadows, can be the backbone of conservation. And they support the greatest diversity of all kinds of different wildlife and are really important for our overall ecosystems, but they can't do it alone. Without private lands, without working lands, all of those lands are really important to the solution. So just trying to give you a sense of why your piece of habitat is going to be really important is it's all part of connected habitat across the landscape. I mean, what PPAC is doing in towns across Addison County is really important for providing stepping stones between other areas of habitat. A corner of a yard with native plants can help insects move across the landscape, find the resources that they need to keep going. A bee doesn't need as much space as a black bear, right? It just needs a little bit of space. And this can be really important for things like gene flow. So maintaining healthy populations of insects, they need to be able to move and interact and reproduce with each other. Same with plants. So having stepping stones that build connectivity between larger patches is really important. And they really connect us and all of our yards and our neighborhoods. So this is just showing kind of a neighborhood situation where bees are using partial habitats, little stepping stones. Maybe they nest in one yard and then they're visiting plants in other yards. Even that small patch can help them forage or rest in between their visits to other places. And so, yeah, when you zoom out, it turns out these really add up, and especially when we think about how much land is currently tied up in turf grass. So we've talked a little bit about why insects matter, maybe what they need, and how small patches of habitat make a difference. So let's get to the reason that we advertised this talk tonight. the incredible opportunities that lawns present for this kind of habitat work. Across the U.S., we have over 40 million acres of turf grass. By some estimates, that would be the largest irrigated crop in the United States. Even if you don't think about irrigation, it'd be right behind corn, soybean, and wheat as far as cropland. It is a large area, larger than the state of Georgia. So this is a massive amount of space. And instead of thinking of it as like a missed opportunity or a wasted opportunity, I want to think about how much we could do if we turn even 10% of 40 million acres into better habitat, right? That's 4 million acres of habitat for bees. So these lawns could really be opportunities to create vibrant spaces. They also take a lot of work. So I'm not actually here to tell you to do more over the long term. In many cases, I'm actually telling you to do less. Lawns take a lot of work in terms of number of hours. The Bureau of Labor estimates the average American spends 70 hours on their lawn every year. All that mowing can really add up in terms of time and in terms of, gasoline. And there's a lot of intensive things that go into them. Fertilizers, pesticides, all of the time and labor spent maintaining them. And lawns have their value, right? They have their place. They're a great place for kids to run around. They're a great place to throw a dog a frisbee. But in terms of what they're offering to the local environment and the local wildlife, it's kind of lower. It's definitely a lower tier compared to something that flowers. This is a visual that's kind of summing up that value. So on the left, this is the food web in a lawn. You've got a few types of insects that are feeding on the lawn. And then you have a few things feeding on those insects. But you compare that with the food web on the right, which is with a diverse native planting. And that's more food for insects, more interactions between insects and plants, and more food for birds and other wildlife. So that's what happens, in my mind, when we're moving from turf to a small patch of native plants. The diversity kind of ripples outward from the plants that you've put in the ground. So this is my own yard. Some of you may or may not recognize where this is because I live on a major road. But before it was just turf grass. This was when I had just put a few pieces, a few native plants around a stump that was remaining in the yard. And that was a lot of time every few weeks to go in there and mow. And so over the years, we built out into more of a native habitat. Not to say there's still mowed areas around this habitat, but this is actually a lot less work for me. So more life, less maintenance, and a space that gives something back. It's not quiet anymore, it's very loud. There's always something buzzing around in there. So what makes a space come alive? It's not just about planting flowers, it's about meeting the needs of the insects and other wildlife we're trying to support. All land is wildlife habitat. It's only the quality of that habitat that differs. So to do that, it helps to understand a little bit more about where bees live, what kind of habitat elements really make a difference for them. This is going to be introductory for folks who've come to some of my other talks, but I think it's important to just revisit what kind of bees we're focused on, what kind of other pollinators we're focused on, and what they need. So when most people think of a bee, they think of a honeybee, the European honeybee, which is a single species that's very important for agriculture, very important for pollinating crops, also for bakers and tea drinkers who like to drink honey. It is a managed species that was introduced from Europe, so it's not at risk of extinction, but it does face a variety of challenges. How many of you have heard about the colony losses this year? Almost all of you. Yeah, it's a bad year for honeybees. These bees have some of the best documentation in the country because it's a managed species. So this was the largest losses, it seems like, in 30 years. So it's been a bad year. And I see hive losses of honeybee as a canary in the coal mine for what's happening with other species. So they are unique, but they also tell us something about what's going on in the greater environment. In Vermont, we have a very rich diversity of native bees, so things that aren't honeybees that look quite a bit different from honeybees. We have about 353 species. Of those, about 25% feed their babies on special kind of pollen. Usually it's just a family of plants. It would be a specialist bee, right? So feeding only on aster pollen, or only on willow pollen, or only on sunflower pollen. About 55 species have been identified by the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies, which did a very comprehensive survey of bees in the state with a lot of volunteer help. They identified 55 species in urgent need of conservation action. Where do these bees live? Here in Vermont, over 80% of our native bees live in the ground. They live in the soil. They live very differently from honeybees, right? They just have a tiny little hole in the ground. You wouldn't even know they're there. They're just living mostly solitary lives. Another 10 to 20% lives above ground in plant stems or in dead and decaying wood. And 5% of our species here, we have 17 species of bumblebee, which is about 5% of our total species. And they form small colonies in hollow cavities above or below ground. Typically, that's old mouse holes, old rodent nests that they're building their nests in. They're cavity dwellers. So just so that you have a picture in mind of what a solitary bee's life looks like. Solitary meaning honeybees are social, right? So they have a queen and then they have lots of daughters that are helping contribute to the nest. A solitary bee's life looks like this. So this is not from Vermont. So if you're like, there aren't bees out here in February, you're right. Just push everything over by a couple months. So the pupa overwinters in the ground and then emerges as an adult in the spring. The males come out first and wait for the females to come out, and then they mate. And then the males kind of diddle around on flowers while the females do the rest of the work for the rest of the year. So they're building a nest in the ground. They're excavating out little rooms in the ground where they are then bringing back pollen and nectar, building a ball on which they lay an egg. And then once they've done that, they've built the room and the ball, and they've laid the egg, they start in another room and for another baby. So that single female is totally responsible for that entire nest. So she's doing all the digging, she's doing all the foraging, she's doing all the egg laying. So what can we do to make her life easier? That's what I'm trying to think about. Making sure that she has ample flowers to choose from as close as possible to her home makes that trip to the flower grocery store a lot shorter. It's going to make it possible for her to build more rooms underground, to make more pollen balls, and to lay more eggs. So her life is also a lot less dangerous if she can stay close to home while she's doing all of this foraging. So how can we give her a better life? I want to basically tell you that I'm not here to tell you to take your whole yard and overnight transform it into this magical wildlife habitat. That's a lot of work. This is just kind of showing the spectrum of possibilities to move towards that direction. You do not have to go from 0 to 100. Every single step is important. And there's a whole lot more steps kind of in between on this spectrum. So maybe you start mowing a little bit less. Maybe you add in a few native plants here and there. Maybe you stop using chemicals. Maybe you let a patch go wild and see what comes up. So you don't have to do it all at once. Take it a little step at a time, see what works for you in your yard, and start where you are. A lot of what I'm telling you to do is to be a lazier gardener in general. So you can do more by doing less mowing, less tidying, fewer chemicals, less water. It's really about making our landscapes more welcoming to wildlife by being a little bit less manicured. They can still look good though. So I figure some of you here have questions about No Mow May. How many of you have heard of No Mow May? Everybody, amazing. So No Mow May is one of those things that it's an entry point to get people thinking about what they can do. It actually started in Britain, which kind of explains some of how it came about. They launched it as a way to support wildflowers in yards in Britain, and it's been really good at raising awareness. It gets people to kind of pause and think, what if my lawn could be more than just something to manage? But It's not the end-all be-all solution. As many of you probably know, there's a lot of things to consider with no mow May. If your lawn doesn't have any flowers in it and you just let it grow for a month, it doesn't really add much to the landscape. It also becomes very difficult to mow down at the end of the month. So let's consider how we might use that as a jumping off point to think about what more we could do, how it might work for us, not in the UK. So less intensively managed lawns are definitely better for bees. So if you want to keep your lawn, there was a study that was done in Massachusetts looking at residential lawns, and they found that if you just reduce the frequency of mowing, as long as you have some flowers in your yard, you're increasing the diversity of bees that you get on that lawn. So they found actually 93 species of bees using lawn flowers, most of which were things like dandelions, violets, and clovers. So there's a lot you can do just by reducing the intensity and the frequency of mowing over the season. Or mowing a little bit higher. So that's a good place to start. But if you're just doing no mow May, I would also ask you to think about when that mowing starts back up, what will the bees eat after that? So where could I maybe add in some native plants that help build out the rest of the season so that they have something to forage on when there's no dandelions, when there's no clovers? Given all that, is no mow May worth it? I think it's a great starting point, right? It helps us talk about what bees really need and how we can get there. And if we can, again, convert some percentage of all the lawns in the US to think about mowing less frequently, that's better habitat for bees across a really wide acreage. So incremental change can bring some long-term benefits. If we mow less all year, that's great. If we can bring a little bit more wildness, some native plants into the garden, that's great. And if we can reduce the lawn area and replace it with native habitat, that's excellent. So let's talk about how we might get that all-season interest for pollinators. So when we're choosing plants for pollinator habitat, and I think this goes really beyond pollinators to all wildlife, I recommend prioritizing native species. They're adapted to our local climate, to our local soils, and they support a much wider range of insects, including things that have long histories with these plant species. And the caterpillars, right, things like caterpillars that sustain other wildlife have these deep and long-term relationships with these plants. But you should also know I'm not a purist. Non-native plants can still add value in the landscape, and I'm not asking you to pull them out, just so you know. If they are not invasive and they are providing things like nectar and pollen, things like herbs and zinnias and ornamental alliums can add value for wildlife. So a good rule of thumb is just when you're reaching for a new plant, can you bring in a native then? And can I aim for, if you're going to do a new planting, 70% native would be a good target to aim for. So the idea here is just avoid invasive species, avoid those that really detract from the value of the landscape, and focus on building diversity that provides continuous bloom from the spring into the fall. When a bee is flying, is it going to find something to eat? Not all flowers are created equal, especially when it comes to feeding bees. So a lot of the things that look very pretty to our eye have been bred to look good to us, but not to a bee. They are, bigger blooms, brighter colors, double showy petals. When you have something like a double-petaled flower, it's coming at the cost of something like pollen. So a lot of times the double flower is replacing the anther, which has the pollen on it, with another petal. So that doesn't provide much in the way of resources for wildlife. So if you're selecting plants, always, when in doubt, try and go for a straight native species, and ask your nursery about some of their practices, because we don't want to be bringing plants home intending to feed caterpillars and bees that have been pre-treated with insecticides. So if you're curious about that, we have resources to help guide that kind of a conversation with a nursery to ask about practices. This way, you're really not just planting food, you're planting safe and usable habitat. And I'll tell you, I have photos coming up of native plants that I like in my garden, but they also can be quite pretty and attractive to have in gardens. So why plant for diversity? So one of the things I wanted to talk about, because I was just reading some of this research and thought it was amazing. So what does nectar provide? Nectar provides sugar, the carbs that fuel bee flight and activity. It also provides neat secondary plant compounds that help with immune health in bees, that help them, in some cases, fight off things that they come in contact with. Pollen is what provides protein and fat, so that's what is really important for the developing bee babies. And what I thought was really cool that I learned recently is that bumblebees are picky eaters. They choose flowers based on protein and lipid content, so the protein and fat of that pollen. And somehow, across many different kinds of landscapes with many different kinds of plants in them, they manage to achieve the same ratio of protein to fat in what they're bringing in and feeding their babies. So regardless of what plants are out on the landscape, they're going and seeking out the same protein to fat ratio, which is why plant diversity is really important, because some plants have a lot more fat content in their pollen and some plants have a lot more protein content in their pollen. So having a lot of plants available lets them choose which ones are going to bring in the thing that lets them meet their nutritional target. So the other thing that I thought was neat here in some of this research, bumblebees schedule their days to visit the best resources first thing in the day. So if you want to know what plants in your yards are the real preference of bumblebees, go out first thing in the morning with your coffee in hand and just observe your plants at that time, because they're going to hit the best things first. So that's bumblebees. If you're planting for bumblebees and moths, you can kind of think outside the box a little bit beyond flowering plants, but all the diversity of plant life. Native trees are incredible caterpillar food and shelter. Oaks, maples, willows, beech, birch, you name a native tree and you've got native caterpillars feeding on it. For adults that feed, just having nectar plants around that help fuel them over the course of the months that they're around as adults. There's lots of great options for that. And these are a couple of resources if you're interested in gardening specifically for butterflies or for moths that have more information. So, you don't need large acreage to really help pollinators. If you want to start small, this is a friend's place in Burlington. They just wanted to take out a little strip of curb grass and put in some native flowers. You can select just a few of the best species for your site, clump them together for good visibility to the pollinators, add a few native bunch grasses for structure, and you've got a beautiful little wildlife patch. One of the tips here, if you have a little more space, is to pick your woody plants first and then design around them. So this is a space that has quite a bit more opportunity where they've got large and small shrubs as well as canopy trees, and then under that they've got spring ephemerals. Cool season grasses or sedges would also be appropriate for a shade setting like this. So with that in mind, I'm going to go try and give you just a few quick hits to hit that bloom season. These are going to be familiar to a lot of you who have been to these presentations before, but these are just some of my, if you're going to start somewhere, these are some of my favorites. So in the spring, woody plants are really the first to bloom, and they're incredibly important resources for early spring bees, like bumblebee queens that come out first thing, and they really need to fuel up as they start their colony. So things like willows. Willows also support a lot of specialist bees that only go to willows looking for pollen. Service berries, viburnums, blueberries, native dogwoods, all of these support a lot of different kinds of caterpillars and pollinators. Not every dogwood is native, so you do want to double check before you buy. A lovely native is gray dogwood. Also red osier dogwood, which grows well in Addison County, but it's very aggressive, so do be aware. If you have something that, if you've got a space with a lot of wet, it's going to love to grow there. And it's beautiful in the winter. It's got these beautiful red twigs, but it will spread. In the spring, this looks like something you're probably familiar with, poison parsnip, but this is not. This is a native. This is golden Alexander's. And it blooms pretty early in the season at a time when not a lot of other things are in bloom. And it supports not only some specialist bees as well as swallowtail butterfly caterpillars, but it also a lot of different wasps that provide pest control in gardens will visit golden alexanders. Later in the spring, you've got beard tongues, so penstemons, and they're a beautiful bumblebee plant. Bumblebees love to come up into these flowers and grab the nectar. There's also a pollen specialist bee, a mason bee that visits this for its pollen, and they host checker spot butterflies. Moving into the summer, you all know milkweeds, I'm assuming. Milkweeds are a wonderful plant for lots of different wildlife, including moths as well as monarchs. It's attractive as well to bees and wasps and hosts many different caterpillars. Later in summer, I love mountain mints. They are spready, so if you do want to make sure you have enough space to accommodate them, but they're a wonderful nectar plant, and it's a plant that I've seen a very uncommon bumblebee on several times. So bumblebees will come in looking for that hit. And narrow-leaved and Virginia mountain mint are both beautiful plants that can do well in gardens. This is another woody plant, but it blooms later on into the spring, buttonbush. I actually planted a buttonbush in my yard, basically in standing water. It really likes to have wet feet, and it still manages to put out these really great and cute-looking blossoms. It attracts bees, it attracts butterflies. I've also seen this imperiled bumblebee visiting buttonbush as well. Moving into late summer into fall, Joe Pye weed, which grows wild all the way around here. It's also really great to have if you've got a meadow setting. It's very tall, so not something you're going to maybe put right up against your house or leaning over your pathway or anything like that. But if you have the space to support it, it's an amazing plant for moths, butterflies, and bees. And then finally, goldenrods. I feel like, why do I even put goldenrods up here? It's to remind you of their value. They're everywhere, but they're also very important pollen and nectar resources in the fall when bumblebees are building up their stores for the winter. And I encourage you to keep them if you can. So there's so many options, and there's plant lists available to help out. Hopefully there's still some remaining in the back. But I did want to show you just a few photos to show that perennial native wildflowers don't have to look chaotic. They can look contained. So if you're looking for more of a contained plant design, you can still accommodate native plants within that. So this is an example where you've got the woody perennials, small shrubs, alongside perennial wildflowers and native bunch grasses. Bunch grasses can provide great habitat for butterflies, but also for bumblebees that nest underneath them. So sometimes there's that kind of dried grass underneath these bunch grasses, and they'll use that as part of their nest. They'll build the nest underneath it, and then they'll pull some of that thatchy grass into it to insulate. Oops. This is another example here of a rain garden. This is a rain garden next to a library that ran into a storm sewer, and they reseeded it with a perennial mixture. Now it's easier to maintain, and it's providing all of these other benefits for wildlife and erosion control. And we have good examples closer to home in Middlebury. There's lovely perennial plantings around town, and now you can also visit them in other towns around Addison County that PPAC's been involved with. So I do want to talk a little bit. I know I'm running sort of short on time. Okay. I get a lot of questions about how to establish in lawns, and so I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So should I use seed or should I use transplants to do this work? So I will start by talking about transplants, because that's where I started. So transplants are more reliable. You get faster establishment with transplants. You might need a little bit of irrigation, but they are easy to maintain, easy to do weed control in. You can mulch around them, and they can be really good for things like garden beds or landscape plantings. If you're taking a larger area, really the only cost-effective way to do large plantings is with seed. And so they're much less expensive per square foot, but they take a lot of time on the front end to make sure that you have controlled weeds. So it's easier if you're in turf grass where you don't have a lot of other things growing. But if you're trying to convert, say, an old pasture into wildflower habitat, there's a lot of pasture weeds that will easily outcompete your native wildflowers. Native wildflowers are really dinky when it comes to like grabbing nutrients from the soil when there's a better thing that grabs nutrients next to them. So consider expectations, I guess. It requires really good weed control at the front end and a good seed mix and more time to establish. But you can get really good payoff for what you put in the ground. There's lots of different options for how you can do that site prep. I've seen many of these. We've got sheet mulching, we've got herbicide, we've got tarping, using a black tarp to just smother things out. If you're well set up for it, doing something like a buckwheat cover crop through the course of a season to try and smother out, again, other things that might be growing there. What I want to say is really, generally speaking, it is not as easy to get wildflowers established as just tilling one time and then throwing the seeds on the ground, because whatever is in that seed bank is going to be important for whether or not your seeds actually grow on the back end. So what I want you to think about, if you're thinking about seeding, is what plants live there now and how do they grow? So what plants have been throwing seeds into that area for the last 10 years? So what's going to be in that seed bank when you open it up and let other things grow? And are those things that you want to manage in a meadow or not? So if they're things like mugwort, for example, you really have to do very thorough site preparation if you want to be able to establish a wildflower planting in an area with a plant like mugwort that just throws tons of seed on the ground and makes it very difficult for other things to come up. Same with poison parsnip, and we'll talk about how you manage poison parsnip on the back end if you have it in your meadow already. But what this means is if you do it well, you get this very good seed bed. You've really thought about, I've controlled my weeds over the course of a year, I've seeded down, and then it's a process of sleep, creep, and leap over for a native perennial wildflower meadow. The first year it's sleeping. It doesn't look like anything. What's even coming up there? The second year, maybe you start to get some of the flowers coming up, and it's in the third, fourth, fifth year that you see it really leap because the wildflowers have been putting down their roots and they're ready to go. They don't grow like annuals. They take a while to get going. If you didn't do site prep, you might get a sleep and then some more sleep, and then you might have to start over, depending on what comes up. So that's why I encourage you to think about different site prep methods, and I have a couple of resources in the back you can pick up if you're thinking about this. So what did I do in my yard? I went to Taylor Rentals, which I'm sad is not there anymore, and I rented a sod cutter and got my husband to cut the grass off. It can be done without additional site prep, which is very helpful. And when you have a turf grass lawn that hasn't had anything else growing around it, it's a really easy way to actually just quickly do a meadow conversion from lawn. Takes some work, takes some backbreaking effort, but it is very effective for removing that kind of shallow-rooted perennial grass cover. So I don't know where to go. If anyone knows where you can rent a sod cutter around here now that Taylor Rentals is gone, I would love to know about it because I want more. I want to do this again. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I think I'll skip this. Mainly, the main thing is after you've got a meadow in place, you want to make sure you're cutting back flowering weeds that are coming up. You might still have something like mustard or something that's coming up in your planting, and you want to prevent it from going to seed. So that first year after you've seeded, you just want to come through and cut off those flower heads before they go to seed from weeds that are coming up, and let the wildflowers develop underneath them. And then longer term, we're looking at late fall mowing to keep woodies from coming in if you're wanting to maintain it as an open meadow. Mowing a third to let the other spaces rest in between that. Make sure that there's overwintering habitat available. If, however, you are mowing in summer, like some of us might be doing for poison parsnip. So poison parsnip, if you've got it in your meadow, one option is really just to try and mow it before it sets seed. So this would be its flowers, and the flowers have not yet turned into seed heads. Mow it down at that point. It might throw up one more shoot after that, but you're just trying to kind of exhaust it. If you're doing that in a meadow, try and start from the middle of wherever that meadow is and work slowly out from the center to let things that are living in there scatter away from you. So if you're in there with a tractor. Okay. So I think this is just a one slide. I could give you a whole separate talk about how you can do more by doing less and being less tidy and leaving the leaves. But moths and caterpillars and other insects need this space, this debris, in order to live through the next year. And it's providing them with good shelter and good overwintering. So helpful to delay cutting back old plants until the next year rather than doing it in the fall, and generally be less tidy. This is what I call, I'm a lazy gardener, but I'm doing it for the bees. And for the other wildlife and nocturnal pollinators. So stop working so hard and give yourself a pat on the back. This is a question I figured would come up, so I'll just address it here rather than in questions, which is, I'm thinking about taking some of my lawn out and putting it into wildflower habitat, but I'm worried about ticks. And so what I'll tell you is it's increasingly common to treat yards with mosquito and tick treatments, barrier treatments. Those are generally highly toxic to pollinators and other insects. And really the best thing that you could be doing is personal protection. I will say when it comes to ticks, if you have dogs, if you have kids, I'm giving you permission. It's okay to mow some spaces, to have those spaces available for kids and dogs. And so you don't have to worry so much about ticks, which don't like to live in mowed grass. For mosquitoes, I mean, personal protection is important. Source reduction. A mosquito can breed if a bottle cap of water is left out for 7 days in a row. That's all it takes. So just make sure you're turning over your kids' toys or whatever else you might have in the yard to make sure that those standing water areas are no longer available for them. And I wanted to just put in a word for one alternative that controls mosquitoes with much less harm to other wildlife, which is the method that, if you're familiar with Doug Tallamy, he talks about this. This is a larval trap. Basically, it is a 5-gallon bucket in which you put water and grass, and then you let it kind of ferment until it's just super attractive to a pregnant female mosquito. And then she lays her eggs in it, and you put just a little part of a mosquito dunk, which you can pick up at any garden store. This is a larvicide that is specific to the larvae of flies, BTI, and it can control mosquitoes without harming other wildlife. What I would recommend is you can go and get a hydroponic lid for the bucket so nothing else can get into that bucket. You could also do chicken wire, but the hydroponic bucket lid is very nice. Comes with a little net so that birds and other things wouldn't be able to get into the bucket. Do you have any questions about this before I move on? Yeah.
How do you know when to put the mosquito dunk in there? I read about this and I was like, how do you know it's time for it?
Yeah, I would say let it go for like 2 or 3 days, and just don't let it go for the full amount of time a mosquito could develop in that water, right? So give it a couple days and then put it in.
When do you put that out? Like at what point in the spring/summer do you need to get your trap out?
So, this works best too if more than one person is doing it in the local area. But I say when you start being bothered by mosquitoes, that's when I would do it. I mean, if you haven't seen any mosquitoes, then there's no one to lay eggs in your bucket. So, yeah, if you see mosquitoes, I suppose that would be a good time. And you're worried about it. Yeah. Yeah, so don't dump it into other like ponds or standing water that's open, right? So what I do is I go to a remaining area in my turf grass close to the road and I dump it out there. So as far as possible from standing water, or from, streams and rivers and that kind of thing. Okay, I'll have more room for questions soon, but this is just the final couple slides here, that watching your plants and seeing what's working is a continual process of improvement. You can just take a little chunk here and a little chunk there. You don't have to do it all at once. Just figure out what's working and what's providing that buzz that you're looking for in your yard, and add some more of that. So this is a learning process. We're all learning from each other. I am a nosy person, and I will ask people what plants are in their yards, and I'll learn from that as to how I can improve what's in mine. And I wanted to just end with one of my whys. Why do I do this? Insects are one of the most accessible forms of wildlife. This is my son. Bug encounters nurture joy. They nurture curiosity and wonder and connection. This is actually just yesterday in our yard next to a woodpecker-eaten stump that had roly-polies in it. So I just want you to think about what's your why and lean into that and hope that it maybe inspires you to do a little bit more to welcome that wildlife into your yard. So I'm available for questions. Thank you.
See, I told you she would be great. So if anyone needs to leave now, this is fine. Just quietly go out the back. But if you haven't made a donation and you would like to make a donation, it's going directly to support the rental of the room and the fee for Emily. So it's all going for that for tonight. She's going to be answering questions for about 20 minutes. And I know you've got lots of questions. So thank you all for coming, and give it about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I have two. One is probably for the pollinator pathway people, but also for you. So my first question is about, there's several new developments going in. Like there's a big one going in Middlebury. And I'm curious, is anybody working towards getting them to just start out by planting wildflowers rather than sod?
That's a great question,
And then the
and
other
we
one
should.
is about clay soil, and if you have recommendations for seeds for clay.
Yeah.
Well, it's amazing in the last 6 months or 9 months, we keep getting people saying, I'd like to do this in my yard, and so on. And we've approached a few places, like some public places, like the Ilsley Library, and some of the other places that are doing renovations. If you're part of those groups, if you go to the Episcopal Church, for example, or if you go to the Town Hall Theater, we're encouraging them to do a pollinator habitat and native plants. But we need the whole community to support it, because people are so used to the ornamentals that, like, some of the peonies and lilacs and all those things that are beautiful, but they don't really add to the, biodiversity. We need to change that aesthetic. So if you know of if you have contacts with people, we don't have a huge staff. We're all volunteers, and so we wait sort of for people to come to us, but we put a lot of publicity out there. So Lily has something in the back here.
I just wanted to add that Ilsley Library, the Pollinator group did work with them to see what their plant list was going to be, and they're doing a great job with putting natives in.
We also have a project going on at the Middlebury Natural Foods Co-op, so you can see how that's coming along. Where's Lily? Where's Holly? Where's Holly? Okay, Holly back here, and some of our other volunteers are spearheading, and we approached them. We said, you've got this space here, can we put a pollinator garden here? And so that we're actually doing the work. They're funding the plants. So we are doing that, but as far as a big development, it's kind of, if they come to us, we'll try to give them some resources. But wouldn't it be nice if the town, before they give a permit and so on, if they would do that? So, but it would be a good question.
That's a pitch for going to the zoning meetings and asking those questions.
I will say I have looked at the plant list for a couple of the developments in Heinsberg, and they look really good. I was pleasantly surprised at what's going in there. So I haven't looked at Stonecrop, but I appreciate the suggestion.
Are there any nurseries that you can particularly recommend that you feel pretty confident are not putting neonicotinoids in their natives?
Oh, that's a good question. The question's about, are there nurseries in the area that are not putting neonics in their natives? And I'm not necessarily here to put a plug in for any nurseries, but I will tell you, I've talked to a few, and Golden Russet provides native plants that aren't treated with neonics. Rockydale in Bristol. I also have gone up to Full Circle Gardens in Essex.
I own a garden, my acres perennial gardens. I don't use neonicotinoids nor any other pesticides. And I have a lot of native plants.
What's it
But I'm
called?
a small nursery. Pardon?
What is it called?
My acres perennial gardens plus. And my website is perennial gardens plus.
Route 116? Route 116?
Pardon?
Where are you located?
South Stockton.
Can you repeat some of the information, because we can't hear it?
Oh, sure. Maybe I'll boom this up. Marelka's, am I pronouncing that right?
My
Mareka's Perennial Gardens in Starksboro, Rockydale Gardens in Bristol, Golden Russet Farm in Shoreham, Full Circle Gardens in Essex, and I'm sure there are more. Yeah. Say that again. Miller Hill Farm, yeah, Nanjangstje, yeah. And Red Wagon in Heinsberg. There's a lot of options that I knew I was going to miss some if I started spouting off options. So one of the issues I will just say with nurseries, it's really challenging for a retail nursery to know what the wholesale nursery that they're purchasing in plants is doing. So it can be challenging. I've spoken with some nurseries who purchase in from wholesalers, and they just don't know. They can't guarantee that there's not a neonics. They may not use them themselves, but it's hard for them to guarantee something that hasn't been in their care from start to finish.
My husband and I have differing views on when to mow the lawn. And last year, we have lots of clovers that come up. And so I was seeing all these bees and stuff out there, and there he goes out with a walking mower. And I'm out there in front of him trying to make the bees go away. Are they gonna go away from the mower? Is he gonna mow over the bees? Like, do I need to worry? How much do I need to worry? I was out there in a paranoid, frenzy.
So the question is about, will bees move out of the way of a mower if you're mowing clover or something like that in a lawn that's got them? I think it depends on the speed of your mower. So that's where
I told him, I said, go slow.
yeah, that's the right advice. Mow slow. If you're seeing bees on that clover, go slowly. That's what I would recommend. If you're doing it on a walking speed, that's going to be a lot safer. You're not going to run over many, if any, bees on a walking speed. If you're on a riding mower that's going very quickly, you could definitely run over something that's on a flower. Mm-hmm.
When we mowed weed, there was a bird's nest in the grass with babies. There was a frog. There was another frog. There were snakes that all got blitzed from the mower. And I always think about that when I would crawl ahead, before I did it.
So the comment was about that there was baby bird and a snake and a frog that all were many that were run over when remowing a lawn after a period of time, or that had come into the lawn in the spring. Yep. So this is where I think if there are places where you can leave where you don't want lawn that can be left more undisturbed, that's going to be a safer place for all of those animals to be. We don't want to create what we would call a trap, right, where you have attracted in these animals and then you're, let's say, treating them with a pesticide or you're mowing and disturbing them. So the more that we can be thoughtful about can we leave some areas more or less undisturbed over the course of the season? Those are going to provide those refuges for those animals to be. And then when you are mowing slow is definitely a good idea to let some of those animals, like a snake, disperse. Yeah.
How do you convert dense clay into a pollinator garden?
How to convert dense clay. What do you have growing in it?
Last year I had buckthorn.
Yeah, we could do a whole other talk about invasive management. So you've got buckthorn in there. You're going to want to deal with that first. So with clay, I mean, it's totally possible to seed into clay, just on a general basis. You asked about clay plants, and I didn't answer your question. But there are clay plants that grow, things like boneset and joe pie and turtlehead will grow in clay. But for buckthorn, you definitely have to manage that out before you start putting in a lot of things that don't compete well against buckthorn. With buckthorn, I have it on my property quite a bit. I have honeysuckle, all the woody invasives. And it is now, I've tried several years of just cutting, and it's really not working. They just keep resprouting. So I'm at the point where I'm going to just cut and then put a little douse of herbicide on the stump of the buckthorn to keep it from coming back, so that I know it's not going to be there next time I look for it. What kind of herbicide? In my case, I'm using triclopyr because I know that's effective, and that's what's in Stump Stop. But there's other products. That's, triclopyr, imazapyr, those kinds of herbicides are the ones that are most typically used for woody control. Glyphosate is also sometimes used. Depends on what you're managing. Some things are more or less resistant to, or aren't going to respond as well to those. But yeah, for a stump, something like triclopyr.
I've killed trees by cutting them to the ground and putting iron pot on top that is much bigger than the stump and leaving it there for as long as you have to. So that's worked for buckthorn and it's worked for, what's that one? Look, never mind. It works for anything with a woody stem, and it takes time, but it's not poison.
I do love that. Thank you. The suggestion was she has used an iron pot and put it over a stump of buckthorn and left it there until the stump is no longer regrowing, and that's worked. So I wish I had more iron pots around.
It's got to be wide enough so they don't,
Push it back up. Yeah.
I've seen it suggested to use like the heavy black urban tarps the same way. You just have to weight them down around the edges so that the light's not getting.
Yeah, the suggestion was to use a black tarp and weight it down around the edges so no light is getting through to the thing that might be regrowing. Yeah, I think I have a couple trouble spots where I might try something like that, but they are so spread out.
What resources would you recommend? I need to want to convert a meadow, so it's probably about at least 1/4 of an acre, and I don't think I can handle that with the sod cutting. So who could advise me on something like that? When to seed? Okay.
I can do that. Yeah, that's my email, emily.may@xerces.org. And if I can't, make it to your site, I have there's lots of resources on this with kind of step-by-step guides on how to do it, different options for doing it. And I would recommend picking up the site prep guide back there. Mm-hmm.
I'll also add, depending on the size of the area, NRCS, although federal funding is, who knows, does have funding for pollinator habitat.
Thank you for mentioning NRCS. So a lot of our staff that works on pollinator habitat creation does it in partnership with NRCS. So this is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They've got an office, at least for now, in Middlebury, Vermont. And they offer financial and technical assistance. So the technical assistance is free to come out to your site and look at it and help you develop a plan for putting in habitat. Mm-hmm.
For doing things like stepping stones,
Mm-hmm.
how close do those stepping stones need to be? Like if you're mostly surrounded by woods,
The question is, how close do you need to be for stepping stones to matter? And I would actually say that they matter even if you're surrounded by woods, because woods are great bee habitat. You wouldn't know it, but in the early spring, forests are totally alive with bees in the canopies. And so they'll come out and they'll move out of the forests in the springtime when the canopy closes up. And so they'll be looking for those resources to get them through. So something like a bumblebee, their nest, so bees are what's called central place foragers, which means they build their nest and then they're foraging kind of a set distance around that nest. A small tiny bee might only travel 500 feet. A bumblebee might travel 1.5 miles. A honeybee will travel in a bad year 10 miles. So those colonies, because they're so big, individuals are seen as more expendable, so they'll go farther to try and get good resources back to the colony. Those little bees are going to be a little bit more careful because, again, if it's a single female and she gets wiped out, that's the end of her nest for that season. So they're more careful and more guarded in where they go.
Emily, that wonderful slide you had of a woodland that had the blue flowers, that woodland phlox, and was that from Addison County?
That was not from Addison County. I know. I grabbed that from a partner in New Jersey. But no, I don't have. There's plenty of other spring ephemerals that are amazing in Addison County. I'm sure many of you know them. We're going to see them soon. But no, that was not native here.
Next step after the buckthorn removal, woodland planters, that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I've been working on some plant lists just for local because I know that people want something that's just local. I don't have them yet. I did make a little plant list for nocturnal pollinators in Vermont for the Vermont Garden Show. So if anybody wants that, I can email it to you.
In my neighborhood, the adjacent neighbor to my lawn uses Camelon or whatever it's called. So is it wise for me to plant pollinator plants, be at my house and then the bees might go to her lawn? She's just like a big lawn.
So the question is, if your neighbor is using a service like True Green, should you even be planting pollinator habitat because of what's happening next door? So I think there's a couple things to unpack. One is, it depends. I think the most harmful thing that a neighbor might be doing as far as a service coming would be something like the mosquito treatments, which are a barrier treatment that goes on kind of as a fog or a spray. We have been doing some work looking at residues in neighbors' yards from those sprays to like figure out how harmful they might be. Sometimes it seems fine, and sometimes it's actually 3 times the level that would kill a bee drifting into a neighbor's yard. So kind of trying to understand what they're doing is important, but I will say that habitat is really important for bees to be able to withstand stress. So if you have bees, they're going to want food, and if they don't have any food resources available and they're getting exposed to pesticides, they're going to be in a worse off place than if there was food available, right? So just like us, our immune systems are boosted when we eat well and when we are well rested and all the other things. That's true for bees too. So if you're putting habitat out, you are also helping them withstand what's happening in your neighbor's yard. So there's that. I think you should still do it. But if they are using a mosquito service, I would recommend thinking about that like a drift, like a pollutant. So putting something in between you and them could be useful if you're able to, plant back a little bit from that yard, and maybe think about something like arborvitae or something that's going to catch drift if they're doing it on a regular basis. Mm-hmm.
Emily? The pollinator pathway in Weybridge, we have a little group that's working on a riverbank right next to the Pulp Mill Bridge. I don't know if some of you have seen that. We're getting rid of Japanese knotweed, and we cut it 4 or 5 times a year. This is our third year. We need to replant that now with something that will hold the steep bank and that will continue to grow up over the Japanese knotweed. So do you have suggestions? And also, I just want to tell people, if you're concerned about Japanese knotweed, it's an incredibly invasive plant. If you have it on your property or you know about it, you should speak to me, because I've been doing a lot of research about different ways to manage it. But what do you do once we pretty much studied it down to about here. That's about as far as it came up last year. So what can we do to replant that steep bank right by the Otter Creek, right next to the Pulp Mill Bridge?
So I think I want to think about that a little bit. But what immediately came to mind were two things. One was sort of species that are meant for erosion control, so fast-growing grasses that are going to do well in a competitive space. But intermixed, you could intermix some natives in there. The other thing that comes to mind would you be able to do like a mulch and transplant into that area? To try like mulching and transplanting into the area so that you've got things that are already well established that could go above the knotweed.
Yeah, we could do that rather than putting in seeds.
Right.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah. Yeah, the neighbor has given us permission. It's on private land, but we saw that threat, and knotweed, if it breaks off, and especially the root, and gets down into the river, then it goes down the river and sprouts up somewhere else. It's a really big problem in other parts of Vermont, but right now in Weybridge, it's not a big problem yet, but we can see it coming. Maybe we have time for one more question. Anybody's a burning question?
I made some beds by like smothering with cardboard, wood chip, and that kind of thing. And I'm curious if so there's still like a lot of wood chip and other mulches and I've made the things growing, but I'm curious, is all that mulch like harmful or preventing like ground nesting bees? Should I avoid using lots of mulch?
So the question is about, should you avoid using lots of mulch because of the ground nesting bees needing to get into the soil? I would say there are, what I would try and do if you have kind of a limited space and you've mulched most of it is make sure some of the backs of your beds have some bare soil available for bees to get into and use if they're looking for a nest. There are some types of mulch that are probably more repellent than others, like cedar mulch, for example, is more repellent to bees looking for a nest, as well as ants and other things that might be wandering around. But yeah, I think mulch wisely, right? They do break down over time, so as long as you're not heavily mulching every year, they eventually would be accessible to a bee. But I would say leave some space available if you don't have any elsewhere in your yard.
I just want to point out that mulch, they cut trees down to make mulch. That's all. And when I found out that, that was ridiculous that I didn't think about that, right? Like cedar mulch and it smelled so good, and then I learned about it, that there's mulch companies and they cut down trees and ship them up. And you can use grass, you can use hay, you can use,
Leaf litter.
yeah, oh, perfect, leaf litter, great.
Yeah, you can. I was just the concern was around mulching, as a result of logging down trees and then chopping them up into wood for use in gardens. Yeah, so leaf litter is also a mulch and also promotes overwintering insects, and the bees can get through it. Right, it's a natural mulch.
All right, I think we're gonna stop now, but Emily will be here just for a few more minutes, like 5 or 10 more minutes as we clean up. That's okay.
Oh yeah.
I want to thank some people.
Here, do you want that?
Yeah, of course. Thank you to Ruth Penfield from the Congregational Church here. Thank you for the church for allowing us to rent this beautiful space. Also, thank you to all the PPAC volunteers, and raise your hands as I call you out here. Margie, who started this all off and got the space for us. Lily is maybe out the back. Jan, Holly, Higby, and I think Robin was at the intake table, but she had to leave. But these are all volunteers who put so much effort. It's just incredible how much effort has been put into PPAC over the 3 years, and all of you are helping us and supporting us as we do this work. I want to thank Cal from Neat TV for doing the filming and making this recording available. And I also want to thank Emily one last time. Let's give her a really big round of applause.